All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're going to borrow a phrase from Thomas Dimitrov about fluidity and movement involving the Falcons roster, talking about the 5 players that went on injured reserve on Thursday and what that means for the Falcons this season, as well as answer your listener questions looking beyond this season to next offseason on whether or not the Falcons will be back in the market to take a quarterback.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka your very humble host of this Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family. And today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline is where the game starts. So we thank everyone that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, you can also check us out on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe, hit that like, hit that bell, and you will get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. So we're going to be talking about fluidity and movement when it comes to the Falcons roster. Borrow from former Falcons general manager Thomas Dimitrov when he talked about athleticism. But as we've been discussing all week long, that this 53-man roster is not complete, and even after today's moves, it still may not be complete. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But the Falcons did add 5 players to their roster on Thursday, re-signing Mike Ford and Dean Marlowe, who were cut on Wednesday. They also re-signed defensive tackle Abdullah Anderson, linebacker Nick Kwiatkowski, and offensive lineman Colby Gossett, who were cut on Tuesday. And yours truly, among several others, had predicted all of those guys, all 5 of those guys, to be on the Falcons' final 53-man roster. And so in order to bring those 5 guys back, they had to clear space with 5 guys, and they did wind up doing the thing that we've been speculating about the last couple of days, which is putting some players on injured reserve. Of course, as you guys recall, and we've explained, that if you wait till after final cuts and put a guy on injured reserve, that player is now eligible to come back, to return from the injured reserve after 4 weeks, at least 4 weeks that they will have to sit out. So we'll see all of these guys potentially. We'll find out. They could be out for longer than 4 weeks, potentially as early as week 5. I believe that's when we play the Bucks. So those 5 players that went on IR were Isaiah Oliver, Deion Jones, John FitzPatrick, Jalen Mayfield, and Marlon Davidson. FitzPatrick, Mayfield, and Davidson were 3 players that we talked about specifically yesterday as candidates for injured reserve with their various ailments. FitzPatrick, we don't know quite the degree of his injury or what exactly his injury was, but he's notable because he did have surgery on both of his feet at the end of last year's college football season with Georgia, playing through that injury, and he's been somewhat limited in practices and in the preseason over the last month. Possibly stemming from that. So maybe it's related to that. Maybe it's something else. Mayfield has been out of practice the last couple of days with an illness, an undisclosed illness, but we know that he was dealing with some back issues earlier in camp that caused him to miss a couple of days of practice. We know that there was a back issue that prompted him from missing the season finale last year. And, Arthur Smith hasn't fully disclosed if those 2 injuries are related, but we can guess, it's not, it's back. So it's probably related to that issue. And so we'll see. Hopefully, those are injuries that don't necessarily go away. So we'll see how that goes. And Davidson has been basically missed practice for the last 3+ weeks with a knee injury. Now, of those 5 guys that went on IR, Jones and Oliver were the 2 sort of I guess surprises, I guess you could say. Jones obviously is coming off the shoulder surgery that he had this offseason that prompted him to miss most of the summer and also miss basically the first month of training camp. But he did return for the preseason finale against the Jaguars over a week ago. But now we're back to another sort of convenient, as I've heard other people term it, way for the Falcons to kind of sideline him again, as was the case when he had that shoulder surgery and missed OTAs and minicamp, as was the case when he was on the PUP list. And now again, he's out And so, it's a little surprising to see him go on IR, given that he was healthy enough to return to practice last week. But, again, convenience and whatnot, and whether you think it's a conspiracy or it's just a series of unfortunate events, to borrow from my guy Lemony Snicket. I think, even though I've been wrong about the team outright cutting him, it seems like this is why I keep being adamant that, like, they've moved on from him, because there always seems to be a way for the Falcons to prevent him from playing. And I think they've moved on mentally. I think they've moved on emotionally. It's just a question of when they will officially move on financially. So basically, this going on IR means that they buy themselves another month of Deion Jones, potential trading him. Gives them a time to figure that out, and punts that decision to at least a month from now. And so it would not shock me at this point in time if at some point in October, he comes activated off the IR. Again, I don't believe that league rules allow you to trade a player that's currently on injured reserve. But, at some point in October, we'll find out on a Monday, oh, Deion Jones is back. He's activated off the injured reserve. And, the following Tuesday, oh, they're announcing a trade or something like that. So we'll see how that goes. Now, Oliver, I think, is probably the real most noteworthy of these 5 players, because all indications had been that he was on track coming off that ACL tear that he suffered in week 4 last year, that he was on track to be ready for week 1. And that was something that ESPN's Mike Rothstein, we had him on the podcast not that long ago, basically come on to talk exactly about that. And so when we were seeing Mike Ford and D. Alford get those first team nickel snaps, I always thought it was kind of just the Falcons slow playing Oliver's return and not wanting to rush him back, but always sort of feeling like, he's going to be there. And then when he played against the Jaguars in the preseason finale, it looked like everything was going according to plan. And so whether this is a setback from that performance, or, this was something that was the plan all along, or whatever it is, it is disappointing that we won't see him out there at week 1. And, when we look at these 5 players going on injured reserve, all 4 of those guys we expected to be backups, but Oliver we did expect to start, and he was going to probably draw the assignment, playing that nickel spot of covering Jarvis Landry in week 1, who we assume will be the Saints' primary slot receiver, although they do like to move Michael Thomas and probably will move Chris Olave around in addition to that. And so now those duties covering those receivers are going to be on Mike Ford, and probably more likely to be D. Alford, who had been getting those starting nickel reps throughout the summer, while Oliver was sort of working with the second and third string teams. We know that Darren Hall also got a lot of work, in Oliver's absence last year at the nickel quarterback. So the Falcons have options, but you do wonder if there's going to be a significant drop off, because whoever is that nickel cornerback, and right now I'm kind of hoping it's going to be D. Alford. He's going to be thrown into the fire right away. Week 1, you got Jarvis Landry. Week 2, you got Cooper Kupp. Week 3, you got Tyler Lockett. So, it's going to be a tough draw for them. And, this is something that we've talked about all summer, where we believed that the Falcons have one of the better starting trios, including Oliver, alongside AJ Terrell and Casey Hayward in the league. But their depth would be tested this year, and you're only as strong as your weakest link, as they say, when it comes to that sort of thing. And so we'll find out if, D. Alford or Mike Ford or Darren Hall is a weak link, because there will certainly be guys capable of exploiting that early in the season. So I don't see D. Alford as a weak link. I think he played certainly well enough for me to believe that he will not be that liability or anything, but we'll obviously find out in a week. And so we'll find out if he gives up 8 catches for 110 yards and 2 touchdowns with Jarvis Landry. That's going to look like a weak link, or, the opposite could be true. And he holds Jarvis Landry to 2 catches for 17 yards. And then we'll be like, oh, man, this guy's going to be a stud. So we're hoping for the latter. We'll see what we get. And part of whether or not we'll see that, we'll talk a little bit more about the players that we re-signed, as well as some of the additions to the practice squad, with Anthony Firkser returning to the roster, something we talked about. And then we'll get into the question and answer portion of today's episode, talking a little bit more about the play calling in the preseason. And we'll get into all of that coming up on today's episode. But we'll be paying close attention to D. Alford and how he performs against the Saints next week, where the Falcons are 5.5 point home underdogs against the Saints next Sunday. And I kind of like betting on the Falcons in that. And I know some of you, knowing my history when it comes to never being able to win the bets with the Falcons, that's probably a kiss of death. And you're probably secretly thinking, this is some grand scheme that Aaron has to jinx the Falcons this year as part of his grand ploy for the Falcons to draft Will Anderson and Jalen Carter next year. And maybe that's the case. And you're probably sitting here like, why aren't you talking about what are the odds that the Falcons have the number one pick? And it's like, well, if you want to find those odds, you got to go to the number one source for all your sports betting needs. And that's, of course, betonline.net. Whether you want to bet on the NFL, Major League Baseball, NFL draft, NBA, NHL, combat sports, esports, golf, you can find it all at BetOnline. It's the number one source for your sports wagering information, from live in-game betting, scores, podcasts. They have you covered. So head to betonline.net today. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, guys, as we continue today's episode of Locked on Falcons, just want to take a moment to remind you that if you haven't already subscribed to us on your preferred podcast platform, including on YouTube, why don't you hit that like on YouTube? Give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform of choice, Apple, iTunes, all that stuff. So really appreciate that. It helps us out here on the podcast. But as far as the Falcons roster goes and the 5 players that we brought back, no sort of major thoughts on that. These are guys that we've been talking about these last couple of days as players that we expected to be on this team this year, expected to contribute in key roles. Mike Ford, obviously now with Oliver's absence for the next 4 weeks at least, he'll be expected to contribute something on defense, but we already expected him to be a proven special teams contributor. Same thing with Dean Marlowe. Abdullah Anderson was arguably the standout defensive lineman of the preseason for the team. And it's notable that he was picked up after the Vincent Taylor injury about a week and a half into training camp. And so it's a testament to him. He hasn't gotten the buzz that a Jared Bernhardt and a D Alford has gotten, but his sort of coming in to camp almost midway through camp, and landing a spot and outshining a lot of these guys, again, you might look at that as a testament to some of the concerns the Falcons had at the depth position, but certainly a testament to Abdullah Anderson. And so gives you some depth there and some size there, and really played well in the preseason. Kwiatkowski was a guy that I thought was going to be the starting linebacker next to Rashaan Evans heading into training camp. Obviously, Michael Walker sort of nipped that prediction in the bud, but certainly is going to give you valuable depth at that linebacker position. And unlike Deion Jones, you're not concerned about his ability to play special teams because that's something he's done on a regular basis throughout his career. And, I've been one of the drivers of the Colby Gossett hive/bandwagon over the past year, saying things like he's better than Jalen Mayfield and probably should have been the Falcons starting left guard last year. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily the highest bar to clear, being better than Jalen Mayfield, but I'm guessing I probably will get a lot less pushback saying those things this year than I did a year ago. So the other notable roster moves were the Falcons bringing back 2 tight ends to the practice squad, and Anthony Firkser and Tucker Fisk. We talked about how Firkser was a surprise cut for the team. And my guess is, again, feeling like he was going to get brought back to the roster at some point. I think my guess is I still believe that, because at some point over the next 8 to 9 days, I feel like the Falcons will probably elevate him from the practice squad to the 53-man roster. It's just hard for me to imagine the Falcons going into week 1 with just Kyle Pitts, Parker Hesse, and Felipe Franks as their 3 tight ends, especially given how much more on average the Falcons use 13 personnel or 3 tight end sets than your average NFL team does. Now, Parker Hesse's ascension to the number 2 tight end makes perfect sense to me because he's an outstanding blocker. We saw how much Lee Smith played in his role for the team a year ago, and granted it was on a smaller sample size, but Parker Hesse was a better blocker last year than Lee Smith was. So his being part of the rotation makes total sense, but going into a game being like, hey, let's give Felipe Franks some real snaps at tight end. Again, he's a project at this point in time. So I would be shocked if Firkser's not on the roster come, some Sunday, September 11th. So I still believe that the roster remains fluid in that way. These moves does leave one more spot available on the Falcons practice squad. We talked about the 13 guys, including Kadar Homan, that was officially announced on Thursday that we talked about on yesterday's episode. I'm expecting that to be a special teams player, to be determined special teams player. Maybe it could be a quarterback, but it's notable on Thursday the Falcons did work out a trio of long snappers. So that to me is indicative. We may see them work out maybe some punters and some kickers over the weekend as well, to sort of save that last practice squad spot, for the patented Elliott Fry role that we saw last year, where Fry every single week was brought up to the practice squad, brought up to the roster, and put down every single week. So I think there will be an emergency specialist added. So enough of the roster talk. Let's some cues, and we'll get into all of that as we continue today's episode, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast as your second listen after you've made Locked On Falcons your first listen. Of course, Locked On Sports Atlanta has 3 shows with 4 hosts giving you all the lowdown on local sports and national sports. That's A to Z with Mark Zeno, Hitting Hard with John Chucker, and ATL Day Ones with Jarvis Davis and Tanitra Batiste. Find them all on the same podcast feed, on the same podcast platforms that you're checking out Locked On Falcons, including on YouTube. And if you subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube, you'll get the Locked On Braves postcast breaking down every Braves win and loss this year, as well as the Locked On Falcons postcast, where myself and Jarvis Davis will be coming at you every Sunday after every Falcon game this fall to give you the breakdown on what happened on that given Sunday. So subscribe to Locked On Sports Atlanta on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So our first question is one that I wanted to answer on yesterday's episode, but didn't have enough time to do so. And it comes from Chad Van Horn at Chad Van Horn 77. He says, how do you feel about our play calling so far, up or down from last year? I liked our more run heavy approach this past week, but do you think we can continue when our ones are on the field, or is that just wishful thinking? So Chad is, of course, talking about the play calling in the preseason. And as a rule, I do not spend much time or energy thinking about play calling in the preseason, Chad. Play calling in the preseason is very vanilla on purpose. Now, I do think it's very reminiscent of the play calling we saw last season. So I would, to answer your question, I don't feel like it's changed that much, but I think it's acceptable in the preseason because there's a reason to being vanilla in the preseason, but not so much. To me, that's an indictment of the team's play calling last year, which, if you've been listening to me talk about it for basically the last 10 months, I frequently spend a lot of time talking about how vanilla their play calling was. But, the reason why it's fine in the preseason is because the preseason is mainly about evaluating your roster. Now, some of it is preparing your guys for the season. You want to get some veterans, some live reps, since it's basically been 8 months since a lot of these guys have gotten hit. Certainly it's benefit for quarterbacks and other offensive players to get the timing down and rhythm in the offense. Obviously, for young players like your rookies and your draft picks, you want to get them used to the speed of the game in the NFL. But the main purpose of the preseason is really to whittle down your 90-man roster to the 53 guys that you're going to keep. And really, it's really whittling down about 50 guys, because most teams go into the summer with about 30 spots locked in or 40 spots locked in, and that they know are going to make the team, assuming that they stay healthy. And I would estimate that number for the Falcons heading into the summer was probably between 35 and 38, where we knew that those guys were going to be on the team should they stay healthy. And so those last 15 or so spots on the 53-man roster, as well as the 16 spots on the practice squad, combined for about 30 spots that you're looking to evaluate roughly 50 or so players that you're not necessarily sure if they're going to be contributors for you. And that's really what the preseason is about. And that leads to teams being very vanilla with their play calling, so that they can do apples to apples comparisons. You only want to run 5 routes for your receivers. You only want to run 5 run plays in the running game, so that when player A gets 10 snaps and does well on and executes his assignment on 8 of those snaps, and player B has the same workload and only executes on 5 of those snaps, you can know that maybe player A is better suited to be one of those 30 guys that you're whittling down from 50 over player B. And so that, for that reason, I don't necessarily am concerned with play calling in the preseason, especially if it's vanilla. Now, if we get into the regular season, you're still asking your receivers to run only 5 routes and only having 5 run plays in your offense and just running those over and over again. I do think that's going to be a little bit of a problem facing some of the quality defensive players, especially. One of them is behind me on my poster, and Aaron Donald. That's going to be a bigger issue then than it is going to be in the summer, when you're going up against a bunch of other guys that are basically second, third string guys that are trying to make the NFL roster and all that various stuff. So, it goes back to the analogy I used often last year. Arthur Smith is a chef opening up a restaurant with a limited menu. My hope is that we see that menu expand, but I don't think the preseason really reflected any sort of expansion in the menu. It's basically the same, but I wouldn't look at that as a concern or a red flag, because that's what it's supposed to be in the preseason. It's only becomes a problem when you don't see that expansion in the regular season. So let's move on to our next question from Comfortably Numb at account Drew on Twitter. He asks, with the 53-man roster set, knowing our strengths and weaknesses, if you were the GM, how would you spend the cap space we have next year across the team? Pretty simple, Drew. The trenches, right? The Falcons are going to have potentially around $75 million in cap space going into next offseason. And frankly, from my perspective, there's no excuse for them with that type of spending money and flexibility for them to basically, when PFF does their offensive line rankings next summer, to have them 28th best offensive line in the league, or when they do their defensive line rankings next summer, to have them dead last in the league like they are this summer. So with that type of money, we need to really address these trench issues. Savion Mixon at MixonS_NFL asks, let's say Ritter plays the last 8 games starting November 10th for the brand. What are your projected stats? So, Savion, I do not have current projections. I plan on doing that, unveiling that. I usually like to do that on the Thursday as the season opens, on the sort of the season kickoff episode, season preview episode. So that'll be probably Thursday morning on the audio, Wednesday evening on the YouTube. And so I'll work on those projections and my sort of official win-loss prediction record for the Falcons for that episode. So I don't have an answer for you, but it is in the pipeline, is what I'll say. At Xella 610 on Twitter asks, how is your mental health, Aaron? Falcons suck and Falcons Twitter is even worse. I'm doing better. All right. I'm in therapy now, thanks to BetterHelp, and they're currently not a sponsor. But should they buy back in, I can certainly honestly promote them. Of course, I support all the sponsors of the Locked On Falcons podcast, like BetOnline and whatnot, but certainly BetterHelp has had seemingly so far has had a more impactful impact on my life than basically me flushing money down the drain, betting on the Falcons or betting against the Falcons. As far as Twitter, Twitter's Twitter. I try not to take it too seriously, as many of you guys can guess. As far as the Falcons go, I try to divorce myself from getting any real meaning and value out of their success or failures, trying to divorce my mental state and emotional state from that stuff. But obviously that can be difficult at times when your job, your livelihood is, surrounding the team. But one of the things that I've tried to work on with that is, not to make it about the team and just really it's about you guys. And that's what's interesting, because, I know there's been a couple of comments I've gotten over the last couple of months that think, I do this because of my ego. And like, I won't deny that I do have an ego, but I think that ego is more tied to my belief that I do this job, breaking down and analyzing this football team better than anybody else. But the main motivation behind why I do this is the same motivation I had, 15-ish years ago, back when I was decided to start covering this team for FalcFans.com, RIP, and blogging about this team, because I feel like you guys, the fan base, are an underserved market. That whether it's the local coverage or the non-existent national coverage, that there isn't a lot of good Falcons coverage. And that's the thing that inspires me every single day to wake up and come on this podcast and rant about the Falcons. And because I feel like, you guys deserve really good coverage of this team, and I do my best, and I'm sure many of you guys out there would agree with that assessment. I'm sure there's just as many, if not more, that would disagree with that assessment of that. So that's kind of where I'm at mental health wise, and I'm working through some of those things. But the reason why I answer this question is because I do feel like, as someone who's new to therapy, but is seeing some benefits from it, I think there's always often a stigma, particularly given that I know over 90% of the listenership is male, and there's sort of this sort of performance, as I've heard it often phrased, of masculinity, of like, having that stiff upper lip and sort of enduring and being self-reliant and all these various things. And so, being able to talk to another person that, is basically therapy that can help you work through some of your issues, is seen as like, not masculine enough. And particularly for people of color, Black men like me, given how historically our treatment has been in this country and throughout the world. I think there's also pressure on us specifically to be even perform that masculinity, a more hyper version of that, by that whole notion of we have to be twice as good to get half as much. And so then we have to overperform that masculinity. And so therapy is specifically for us is seen as even more of an issue for us. So I would just, I want to take this moment to say, like, if you're out there looking for help, then go get the help. And I think it's certainly something that is worthwhile for a lot of people out there. So hopefully, this will move the needle for at least a few of you, that maybe you can be in a better place from a mental health standpoint in a couple of months or a couple of years from taking that leap, if you're willing to do so. So we'll leave that aside and get to the final question of the day. Clearly, as the theme has been, not as many people invested in this upcoming season, because we're going to talk about, next offseason with the quarterback situation. And we got two questions from Mark Reimers 5 and Slick Rick Ick 11 on Twitter. Mark's question is: we all know Ritter has the potential if he starts midseason and just had an okay performance. Do you think we draft a different quarterback next year, or do you think we will stick with him as a possible starter next year? And then Slick Rick X question is: say we finish 3-14, is the team going to use a top 3 pick on a quarterback, or do you think we'll stick with Ritter? So to answer your questions, I do think it's likely that Desmond Ritter will start for the Falcons week 1 of 2023. I'm sure I will hear from a certain segment of you, pushing back against that. I feel like I didn't feel that way, 3 months ago, that it was likely. But I feel like Ritter's performance this preseason has increased those odds. And I would personally say I think it's greater than a coin flip. Again, whether it's 60%, 55% or something, or greater than that, time will tell. Obviously, there's a lot of unknown factors and variables. Sitting here talking today about that I won't pretend to know an insight. It's just a guess. So when you when you go after me in the comments, just know I do know, like, I don't actually think I could predict the future in that. But if I was guessing, making a semi-educated guess, I do think it's likely. But a lot of that depends on how Mariota plays, how Ritter performs, how this team performs. And so all of those are unknown at this point in time. So I do think it's likelier than probably a lot of people realize. I want to make 2 points, stress 2 points, 2 kind of assumptions that I think a lot of people make. I think people kind of overrate the sort of direct link between how good the quarterback is, what this team's win-loss prediction is, and how high they're going to be drafting. Like the idea of, oh, well, if we're picking top 3 or top 5, then we're going to definitely be wanting a quarterback, because that means that the quarterback didn't play well. And again, it's not common, but there are plenty of examples over the last couple of years of teams that had relatively decent to good quarterback play, and were not particularly good at football. You go back to the Falcons in 2020 when they finished 4-12, and picked 4th overall in the draft. They were the 14th most efficient passing offense in the league that year, and the team that picked ahead of them, or at least originally held that pick ahead of them, was the Texans. Deshaun Watson, they were the 3rd most efficient passing attack in the league when you look at certain metrics like adjusted net yards per attempt. So it's not impossible for you to get good quarterback play and still be a bad football team, because it's not, quarterback play is critical to team success, but it's not the only factor that involves team success. And I think when it comes to Mariota versus Ritter, I do think the bar for Mariota is considerably higher for him to retain the job than it is for Ritter. I do think Mariota's best chance of returning the job is if the team does have, finishes above 500 and is in competition for the postseason by year's end. And I think for him to lead this team at that level, my personal opinion, and again, I won't go too deep into why I think this, but my personal opinion is he kind of has to be like a top 10 quarterback to elevate the rest of this roster to that level, to be able to win, 8 or 9 games against this upcoming schedule. That's my perception, but I don't think Ritter has to be that good for that. I think, to me, Mariota kind of has to be Russell Wilson to elevate this team to that level, which, again, it's not that I don't think Mariota is a good player. I just don't think he's that on that level as a player. And then Ritter, I think, kind of has to just be like Davis Mills. He could be like the 25th best quarterback in the league. And I think given certain circumstances, again, we don't know all the factors and variables, but I think that might be good enough for the Falcons to run it back with him next year. And just basically believe that there was enough flashes, and with, investments in the trenches and elsewhere, that, this team can make a big leap next year. The other assumption that I see people often making is, I think, the assumption that we already kind of know that the upcoming quarterback class will feature better options, even if the Falcons do pick high. Like, again, I think we can say with a good degree of confidence that the overall quality of next year's draft class will be better than this past year's draft class, but that does not guarantee that if the Falcons have a top 3 pick or a top 5 pick or a top 10 pick, that there will be a quarterback on the board when it's time for them to pick that they're going to feel good about, right? Like, that was the whole thing with the Justin Fields things. That was the takeaway, whereas it wasn't that Justin Fields wasn't good enough for the 4th overall pick. It's just the Falcons and several other teams picking the top 10, you know, didn't love him enough to pull the trigger on him. And that's why he fell to pick 11 or whatever it was. And all you got to do is kind of look back at the last 5 or 6 years drafts to see this, you know, particularly when it comes to the quarterback position. Like, we all know that the draft is a crapshoot and it's all just guessing, but we already know that, like, it's hard enough to evaluate quarterbacks in April on how good they're going to be in the NFL. The September before that, like, is nearly impossible. And you just kind of go back to the 2017 draft, where going into that previous season, Deshaun Watson was clearly QB1 and he wound up being QB3, taken 12th overall, and unknowns like relative unknowns like Mitch Trubisky and Patrick Mahomes leapfrogged him. You know, we've had 3 number 1 picks over the last 5 years: Joe Burrow, Baker Mayfield, and Kyler Murray, that essentially came out of nowhere to be the number 1 overall pick, that going into that season, you know, were being projected as like 3rd round picks. Like, no one had heard of Kyler Murray because he was a backup to Baker Mayfield the previous year. You know, he hadn't played it at all. Kenny Pickett's a good example of a guy that went from a mid-round talent to being the first quarterback taken on the board. Like, basically, Trevor Lawrence is the one outlier out there of a guy that we knew going into his final year of college football was going to be the guy, and stayed the guy. Like, you know, the Joe Burrow draft, that was Justin Herbert and Tua draft. Everybody thought those were the 2 stars, right? The Baker Mayfield draft, for a year and a half, people were saying Sam Darnold's the next guy. And so, like, I want to make that clear, because, you know, I think the assumption that a lot of people make that Bryce Young and CJ Stroud and whoever else, like, again, you can say, look collectively at, you know, the top 5 or 6 quarterbacks potentially in this upcoming draft class, and say, hey, I think these guys are collectively better than the top 5 or 6 quarterbacks in last year's draft class. I have no problem, you know, agreeing with that statement, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if the Falcons are picking 3rd or picking 7th or picking 11th or whatever, that you're going to like one of those guys to pull the trigger on. And certainly history kind of tells us that, particularly the guys that go into the fall highly touted, their stocks tend to fall over the next 6 months in the lead up to the draft as people nitpick them to death. And I think that's going to be something that, you know, a lot of the buzz and a lot of the, you know, the assumptions that people make that, oh yeah, these Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, specifically Bryce Young, has, you know, a height deficiency. And there's been plenty of evidence over the years that NFL teams generally do not like short quarterbacks. Again, obviously Kyler Murray and Baker Mayfield have, you know, sort of nixed that notion in recent years, but it's not as if like, oh, like, you know, outside of Drew Brees and Russell Wilson, there aren't that many like 5'11" quarterbacks that you can sit here and say, oh man, these guys were incredible. So there's still some concerns there. And then, you know, we know the Ohio State stigma. You know, Joe Burrow was only escaped it by leaving Ohio State. You know, and it kind of hurt Justin Fields a little bit. It's hurt Dwayne Haskins, the late Dwayne Haskins, as well as others. So, you know, these are, again, not trying to sit here and say that these guys are bad quarterbacks, but I do think people assuming that, like, oh yeah, there definitely will be a quarterback picking wherever the Falcons are selecting, that we will fall in love. And I think, you know, I know I'll get some pushback because people will say, well, you just want the team to draft Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, and so that's why you're saying this. And I'm like, no, I'm saying that simply because, like, we there's a rich history of telling us that, you know, that we what we think we know, particularly this time of year in September, we have no idea. And that also applies to Will Anderson and Jalen Carter. Like, there's been plenty of examples in the past where it's like, oh, I know this guy's going to be a stud, and then we fast forward the clock a couple of months later, and it's like all of a sudden, I don't know, right? Like, this was the one lesson I learned about Josh Rosen, right? Josh Rosen was my QB1 going into that 2018 draft, largely due to the fact that 2 years prior, when I was watching Devin Fuller, the Falcons draft pick out of UCLA, I fell in love with Josh Rosen, who was then a freshman, and being like, this guy's going to be the next Matt Ryan. And sort of I cemented my opinion rather than, and when red flags came up over the next 2 years, I kind of ignored them because, I had a confirmation bias, so to speak. And I think that was one of the reasons why the whole Kayvon Thibodeau stuff came up last year, where people had already sort of cemented themselves, oh, Kayvon Thibodeau is going to be the next superstar pass rusher. And then when there was kind of a pushback against that, following last year season in the pre-draft process, people were like, why are we overthinking Kayvon Thibodeau? And it's like, I don't think people are overthinking Kayvon Thibodeau. I just think people kind of realize, and we'll see what time history will tell us. But, I think there were legit reasons why Trayvon Walker and Aiden Hutchinson leapfrogged them, because I think they were better overall prospects than Kayvon Thibodeau. And people were just sort of cemented on what their opinion on Kayvon Thibodeau was 2 years ago. And rather than sort of being open to the idea. So, despite me being all in on Jalen Carter and Will Anderson at this point in time, like, contrary to popular opinion, I am open to the idea that they may not live up to that hype. And some of the quarterbacks that I may not be as high on today, I may be much higher on tomorrow, so to speak. So we'll see how it all goes. Long story short, that, I do sit here and think that it's likely that, Desmond Ritter is the guy. But, there are other factors that I think play into, why there's a pushback against the idea of the Falcons, being quote unquote all in on Desmond Ritter long term, but we won't get into that. I've already kind of belabored the point on today's episode, but I'm sure there will be plenty of opportunities over the next several months to talk about those things, as well as get to some of those listener questions that I did not get to on today's episode. But guys, I really appreciate you sending in and submitting those questions. Of course, you can hit me up on Twitter at Locked On Falcons or Facebook at Locked On Falcons. You can send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. But that's going to do it for us here, guys. And really appreciate you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen. Always recommend your second listen being shows like Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves. And, you can also check out the Ultimate Pro Football Preview 2022 as your second listen, ongoing right now, an 8-day extravaganza that began on Wednesday on its own podcast feed. All you got to do is search for Ultimate Pro Football Preview on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts to get the lowdown from the local experts like myself, Odyssey NFL insiders, and the betting angle from Lee Sterling of Locked On Bets, all combining into that ultimate NFL preview going on right now. So guys, really appreciate it. I hope you have a great Labor Day weekend. Enjoy this last, release of summer, of freedom, of joy and happiness, until the Falcons inevitably disappoint you this season. So we got our fingers crossed that, they will do the thing, and we're going to surprise some folks. I've heard a lot of people say that. And it's like, yeah, I think we will surprise some folks. All the people that think we're going to go 2-15, they will be certainly surprised when we go 5-12. So yeah, we'll see what happens, guys. But I appreciate it. Until then.